How does one summarize the Necrons? As the sci-fi answer to the undead faction seen in so many different fantasy settings? As robot Egyptian mummies in space? As a race of ruthless warlords possessed of an undying hatred of everything that lives? As tragic victims of an ancient and vile Faustian bargain? Perhaps the simplest answer is to say that there is no way to summarize the Necrons. And perhaps the only proper way to start is with their beginnings. So, let us go back over 65 million years into the past, when the galaxy was a younger and far different place. Back then, instead of Necrons, there was the Necrontyr, a somewhat humanoid Xenos race that had the terrible misfortune of evolving on a planet orbiting a sun that was highly unstable. Said instability resulted in high levels of dangerous radiation, to the point where I have to wonder how life survived at all on that world, let alone last long enough to achieve sapience. As a result of living with such a temperamental solar body, the Necrontyr race suffered all the various symptoms of acute radiation poisoning. Lesions, sores, internal bleeding, tumors, the list goes on. For the Necrontyr, life was short and painful. Perhaps unsurprisingly, their culture came to revolve around death, which, rather than being feared, was seen as a release from the suffering of life. Necrontyr society was a mostly rigid caste system, ruled over by various aristocratic dynasties, each ruled by a pharaon. The pharaons in turn answered to a triumvirate known as the Triarch, composed of the three most powerful pharaons, and the leader of the Triarch is referred to as the Silent King, for traditionally he only spoke through the other two. Eventually, the Necrontyr race made its way to the stars, although they never did figure out any form of faster-than-light travel, thus leaving them at the mercy of the vast emptiness between stars. Fortunately, the Necrontyr had managed to invent the stasis field, a force field that doesn't freeze time, but slows it down to the point where it might as well be frozen. All crewers and supplies would be placed inside the stasis fields, which were then loaded aboard the slower-than-light-speed ships, and then sent off into the void, relying mostly on guidance computers to reach their destination. In this way, slowly but surely, the Necrontyr managed to establish a modest empire amid the halo stars at the northern rim of the galaxy. And it was sometime around this point that they encountered the Old Ones. No one really knows much about the species known as the Old Ones. The only things we know about them for certain are 1. The Old Ones were reptilian in origin, 2. They held all life to be sacred, and 3. They were by far the most technologically advanced species to ever exist in the 40K universe. Their knowledge and technology is second to none, and most of it has been lost or forgotten by the races that came after them. The two most relevant creations for this particular subject were the Webway and their advanced medical technology. The best way to sum up the Webway is that they were subspace tunnels through the dimension known as the Warp. But where modern voidcraft has only a flimsy Geller field between itself and the roiling madness of the Immaterium, the unknown material comprising the Webway completely insulates the traveler from its corrupting effect. Mind you, the Warp was a much calmer and far less dangerous place back then, but why take chances? With this, the Old Ones had been able to create an empire that spanned the entire galaxy, and, much to the anger of the Necrontyr, they'd already taken most of the best planets for themselves. As for the Old Ones' medical science, while not immortal, they had gotten to the point where they could effectively extend their lifespans into the thousands of years. And it was over this issue that the problem really started. In their initial contact with the Necrontyr, the Old Ones were all friendliness and sympathy, but alas, they refused to cure the Necrontyr of their radiation-induced afflictions. The explanation the Old Ones gave was that at this point, the radiation-induced illnesses were literally baked into the Necrontyr on a genetic level. Curing them would require such radical genetic engineering that the Necrontyr would no longer be Necrontyr. In the minds of the Old Ones, changing a species beyond recognition was the equivalent of destroying it, and so they refused. Needless to say, the Necron tier did not receive this well, either the refusal or the excuses. Outrage aside, though, the Necron tier had even bigger problems at hand. When yours is a civilization spread over interstellar distances, without the benefit of faster-than-light-speed travel, connection between the central government and local authorities is tenuous at best. At this point in time, the pharaons of the various colonial dynasties decided that they would be better off governing themselves and no longer obeying the wishes of the Triarch, thus threatening the Necron tier empire with dissolution. Desperate to avert this fate, the Triarch, led by the Silent King known as Zarek, hit upon an equally desperate idea. One of the easiest ways to get people to come together is to unify them against a common enemy. And luckily for the Triarch, the Old Ones were conveniently to hand. All Necron tier hated the Old Ones for refusing to grant them near immortality or cure them of their afflictions. The Triarch assumed that, because of the Old Ones' reverence for life, that for all their size and influence, they would be easy pushovers. The Necron tier would remain unified, they could gain some nicer new planets for themselves, and the local pharaons would each have opportunities to aggrandize themselves in battle. Thus began the war known to the Eldar as the War in Heaven, simply because it's the only name for it we know. Unfortunately, the Triarch had badly misjudged the Old Ones, who, while not eager to start a fight, were more than capable of finishing it. The war was short and sharp, and the Necron tier lost badly. The Old Ones simply had too many advantages. They had more numbers, they had more resources. The Webway, of course, made them able to move their fleets infinitely faster than the Necron tier, and of course, their technology was far superior. Rather than making any sort of gain, the Necron tier ended up losing nearly every world in their empire except for their original home planet. And it was only the Old Ones' reverence for life that saved the Necron tier from being exterminated in their entirety. Given the events that were about to follow, one can't help but wonder if the Old Ones ever came to repent of their humanitarianism. Meanwhile, the Necron tier Triarchs were in dire straits. The war that they had intended to use to unify their species had backfired spectacularly. All the pharaons of the various dynasties that had already been inclined to secede or rebel against their authority were now even more embittered towards their leaders, and were determined to go their own way. Others insisted that the Necron tier should sue the Old Ones for peace. It was then that Zarek, the Silent King, noticed that there was something going on near their sun. Something or someone was hovering right next to it and seemed to be siphoning off energy from the sun into itself. An entity that seemed to be comprised entirely of energy. There are no details as exactly how first contact was made, matter and energy being two different states of being. But eventually, the Necron tier did find a way of communicating with the entity hovering about their sun. They somehow persuaded it to enter a body of living metal called necrodermis that had been prepared for it. And at last, they could communicate on the same level. The being introduced itself as Azagorod the Nightbringer, and that it was but one of many. A race of beings that claimed to be as old as the universe itself, and, more to the point, and certainly more to the interest of Zarek and the other members of the Triarch, ancient enemies of the Old Ones. Where the Old Ones possessed a great reverence for life, the star devouring entities considered any life beyond their own to be inconsequential. Stellar energy was their food source, and what mattered to them if billions of innocent beings die without the light of their suns to warm their planets? Seeing as Azagorod and his fellows had no name for their race, the Necrons eventually called them the Catan, a word from their language that means either star god or star vampire. The latter is apt, given the behavior just described, but the former was even more so. For even though the Catan, as far as we've been able to determine, are purely material beings with no connection to the warp, they seem to possess, well, godlike power. They can essentially bring things into being just by willing them into existence, in complete defiance of the laws of conservation. While the Necron tier leadership was grappling with the fact that they had just encountered a race of entities that had discovered the veritable cheat codes of the universe itself, the Catan had made a discovery of their own. With their new solid matter bodies enabling them to interact with the mortal races on their own level, they had discovered that there was something even more delectable to eat than solar energy: the pain and suffering of sentient beings. Because grimdark. Soon after this discovery, one of the Catan, ominously named Mephat-Ran the Deceiver, approached Zarek and the other Triarchs with an offer. The Catan would use their powers to cure the Necron tier of their numerous afflictions, the very thing the Old Ones had refused to do, and grant them the power and weapons needed to destroy their hated enemy. In return, the Necron tier would harvest life from the galaxy so the Catan could torment and then feed upon them. In fairness to Zarek and the other Triarchs, they weren't quite so gullible as to accept the proposal outright. They spent at least 3 years, according to some sources, deliberating over the idea and whether or not there was some way this offer could bite them in the ass. Eventually, they decided that this was in fact a painless deal and accepted the offer. To fulfill their end of the bargain, the Catan materialized a series of strange glowing temples that they called biofurnaces, informing the Necron tier that in order to rid themselves of their afflictions, they must pass through the flames of biotransference and would be granted bodies that were free of pain, better, harder, faster, and stronger than ever before. Many Necron tier walked willingly through those ominous green flames. Others had to be dragged in chains, but eventually it was done. After what can only be described as a process involving a lot of hot metal and searing agony, Zarek, the silent king of the Necron tier, re-emerged into the light and discovered that for the first time in his life, there was no pain, no weakness, not even the mildest discomfort. His body of flesh and bone had been replaced by one of living metal known as necrodermis. Instead of a brain, he now possessed a highly advanced supercomputer in his head, and built into that computer was a control chip with which he could use to directly control every single member of his entire species, thus at last achieving the unity that he had sought for. However, Zarek discovered that something was off about his new form. He seemed incapable of certain emotions, such as joy, contentment, or even mercy. And then he turned around and saw what had become of his people. The green flames of the biofurnaces leapt high into the sky, and above these biofurnaces there swooped the Catan, gleefully devouring the souls of the Necron tier people. What emerged from those biofurnaces was rank upon rank of soulless, mindless automatons, bereft of any form of individuality or free will of their own. Only the Pharaons and other high-ranking members of Necron tier society had managed to retain even the barest fragment of their original identities. The rest were essentially mindless slaves, and Zarek realized too late just how thoroughly he had damned his own people. The Catan had kept their word. With these new metallic bodies, the Necron tier would no longer suffer any of the afflictions that so plague organic life forms. And in return, they had been reduced to a mindless, soulless army of the dead. The Necron tier were no more. There was only the Necrons. Unfortunately, there was nothing that Zarek or any of the other remaining Necron leaders could do. The process could not be reversed, and the Catan were simply too powerful, and so they had no choice but to hold up their end of the deal. However, Zarek vowed to himself that he would remain vigilant for any chance that would enable him to make the Catan pay for what they'd done to his people. And so the war in heaven resumed. True to their word, in addition to their new immortal bodies, the Catan made sure to give the Necron all manner of physics-defying technologies to fight the war. Swords that could phase through armor as if it were cutting air, gravitic weapons capable of cracking mountains in half, floating monoliths armed with lasers that would put a Star Destroyer to shame, lasers spewing insectoid war machines, and of course, the trademark Necron weapon of choice, the Gauss Flare, a gun that fires a beam of energy that disintegrates the target in its entirety. True, it takes a couple of seconds for the victim to be torn apart molecule by molecule, but trust me when I say they feel every single second. To their dismay, the old ones suddenly found that they were now the ones at a disadvantage. Even the webway was rendered useless when one of the Catan, named Nyadrazatha the Burning One, invented a series of portals known as Dolmen Gates, enabling the Necrons to access the webway network. Unfortunately, there's very little information regarding the war in heaven. What little there is has been exaggerated by the Eldar as part of their mythology. The Eldar's own accounts involve a lot of hyperbole, entire star systems being snuffed out, whole planetary populations harvested to feed the Catan, and so on. On the other hand, this is 40K, one of the most over-the-top universes in science fiction, so perhaps the Eldar's account isn't nearly as exaggerated as it might otherwise have been. At any rate, the old ones, desperate to save themselves from extermination, decided to take a huge risk. Using their superlative mastery of biology, they managed to genetically engineer several new races to act as soldiers against the Necrons. These races include the Eldar, the Orcs, and according to some speculations, the Tyranids, though this last was never confirmed. The most unique feature of these new races was that they were created to have an especially strong connection to the warp, and thus could channel its power, making them the first Psykers, and the war in heaven as the first instance of psychic power being used as a weapon. On the positive side, neither the Necrons nor the Catan, at least not initially, were able to counter psychic abilities. The Catan eventually did get around to finding a solution to this by creating warp-dampening pylons, which they seeded several planets with, most notably the worlds around what would later become the Cadian Gate. Even so, psychic power still remained a potent weapon against the enemies of the Old Ones. The downside, however, was that the Immaterium, as I mentioned in my Chaos video, is influenced by the emotions of sentient beings, especially those that have a very strong connection to it. And the Eldar in particular exhibited strong connections and potent abilities. This means, though, that because this was a war, producing such emotions as fear, anger, suffering, and misery, these powerful negative emotions in turn began to influence the warp. Where once it had been a relatively stable dimension, it slowly began to devolve into the roiling demon-infested hellscape we know it as in modern 40K. In fact, the very first warp predators were created as a byproduct of the war in heaven, and it was these warp entities, known simply as the Enslavers, that ended up annihilating the Old Ones. Without their hyper-advanced creators, the Eldar and the other younger races found themselves on the verge of defeat once again, and it was here that the Catan made their biggest mistake. The Catan were capable of many godlike feats, but apparently sustainability was not one of them. All throughout the war, the Catan had gone from planet to planet, feeding on the souls, well seasoned with suffering, mind you, of its sentient inhabitants that their Necron slave armies had rounded up for them. Again, because details are so scanty, we don't know how long the war in the heavens lasted. All that we are told is that by this point, the galaxy was almost entirely depopulated of sentient life. And by this point, the Catan were far too used to their new diet to go back to their old habit of sucking energy out of stars. And so the Catan, partly out of hunger, and partly because they have always been vicious, capricious bastards, began to turn upon and even feed on each other. And as the Catan's numbers began to dwindle, Zarek the Silent King finally saw his chance. Activating the command protocols built into his computerized brain, the Silent King ordered his entire race to turn against the Catan, using the very weapons and technology their masters had given them against their own creators. The Necrons were successful in their revolt, but the Catan, being entities comprised of pure energy, could not really be destroyed. And so, the Silent King settled for the next best thing. Each Catan was then divided into fragments, and each fragment was imprisoned inside a highly advanced containment vault known as a Tesseract Labyrinth. Each Kattan shard contained a fragment of the original being's mind, but reduced in this way, they were now little more than power sources or weapons to be used as the Necrons saw fit. Thus, in poetic irony, did the master become slave and slave become master. Unfortunately for the Necrons, that was the end of the good news. Too late, they realized that without the Kattan to create more warp-dampening pylons for them, the younger races left behind by the old ones and their psychic powers were able to gain a second wind and even turn the tide against them. And unlike the old ones, neither the Eldar nor the Orcs were inclined to show the Necrons mercy. Zarek soon realized that the war was lost. The Necrons simply could not win. But there was a way they could survive. Activating his command protocols once again, he ordered the entire Necron race to go into hiding. Hurriedly, the Necrons managed to construct concealed hibernation tombs filled with stasis field generators. Once the work was complete, the Necrons would go inside, power down, allow the tomb's stasis generators to activate, thus preserving their metal bodies against the ravages of time. For Zarek intended to outlast the organics. Eventually, he assumed they would fail. After all, organic life must fail eventually. Just to be certain, he made it so that the Necrons would sleep for 65 million years. By the time they woke up, the organics would be gone, and then they would reclaim the galaxy for themselves. However, Zarek himself would not be joining his people in their millions of years of slumber. Once the last tomb complex was sealed and hidden, Zarek destroyed the control protocols he used to command his people, believing that he had no right to lead the species he had damned to their soulless existence. Instead, Zarek intended to use the next 65 million years to search for a way of reversing the biotransference and restore the Necrons to their former state, preferably without the radiation sickness. And he was determined to find a cure, even if it meant him leaving the galaxy itself. For the most part, Zarek's plan worked. As far as the victorious races could determine, the Necrons had vanished from the galaxy. Even so, 65 million years is a long time, plenty of time for things to go wrong. Many tomb worlds were destroyed by geological phenomena like earthquakes or erupting volcanoes. Still others were destroyed when interstellar bodies like asteroids collided with their tomb worlds. Still others were discovered and destroyed later on by the vengeful Eldar. Still other tomb complexes suffered system malfunctions due to tectonic activity or radiation. The end result was that when the first Necrons began to reawaken right around the time of the Great Crusade, instead of awakening all at once as a unified species, the individual dynasties on various tomb worlds found themselves waking up one by one, scattered and isolated from one another. To make matters worse, while the successors of the old ones had indeed failed, as the Silent King had predicted they would, it seemed that the galaxy was now overrun with even more organics than before, most notably the nascent Imperium of Man. It's here that we encounter a significant historical gap. Obviously, the Imperium never encountered the Necrons during the Great Crusade or the Horus Heresy. But what about the 10,000 years between the Horus Heresy and modern 40K? Apparently, what Necrons were awake at that time decided to lie low for the next 10,000 years, as the earliest instance of a Necron encounter with another race is late M41 when they were fighting against an Orc Wa at the Battle of Fordress. Eventually, the Necrons and the Imperium did bump into one another, such as during the fall of Bromach or the Sanctaro campaign. In all instances, however, the High Lords of Terra chose to suppress the nature of the Necrons' existence, deciding apparently that the last thing the Imperial public needed to hear was that there was yet another hostile Xenos race out there. One of those rare instances of the High Lords of Terra actually making a halfway decent decision. But the spooky skeleton robots couldn't be kept under wraps forever, and the first officially recognized encounter between the Necrons and Imperial forces occurred in the year 897 Millennia 41, when a convent of Sororitas Battle Sisters on the planet of Sanctuary 101 found themselves caught up in the crossfire between two conflicting Necron dynasties. The Necron tier had never been a particularly harmonious or unified species, and these qualities seem to have carried over into their new state as Necrons. The pharaons of the various Necron dynasties seem to spend more time fighting each other than against the organics, more concerned with staking out territory and their own individual aggrandizement than unifying their species. Given the fact that the Necrons have some of the deadliest and most advanced technology in all of 40k, that's probably a blessing as far as the other factions are concerned. Speaking of the other factions, the Necrons' attitudes towards the organic races of the galaxy are somewhat paradoxical. On the one hand, the Necrons hate the organic races because they are a constant reminder of what the Necrons themselves have lost. On the other hand, they are also contemptuous of the organic races, seeing them as weak meat bags, only deserving of being ground under their heel. Still, as disunited as they are, the Necrons simply don't pose the kind of existential threat to the other races that, say, the Forces of Chaos or the Tyranids do. But that might all be changing soon. For at long last, after 65 million years of exile, the Silent King has returned to the Milky Way. Granted, Zarek no longer has the command protocols, so he simply can't control the Necrons like he used to, and there are plenty of powerful and ambitious pharaons that may choose to challenge his authority. Even so, he is the only one who might possibly be able to unify the various Necron dynasties under a single banner. And if he manages to succeed, perhaps even the ruinous gods themselves will tremble before the coming of immortal legions. Untold numbers of soldiers without souls to corrupt, driven only by a burning, deathless hate. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.